Okay, today's subject is going to be clarifying the actual obligation on a community that moves from place to place, whether they have to follow their minhag or they're mitbatel in other communities. And although we did speak about it once before, I don't know how many of you remember there was a Avkat Rochel and there's a stira in the Avkat Rochel. But I recently had the opportunity to revisit this sugya, and I found a few more nikudot that I felt is beneficial to share, and since it's something that's so central, not only for the Moroccan community, but for every single community that they move from place to place and they're found in other communities, to know exactly what the Geder Advarim is. And I'll start with the following, that there's two famous teshuvot written on this subject. The first was written by the Avkat Rochel in Siman Resh Yud Bet. The Avkat Rochel in Siman Resh Yud Bet was dealing with a question from a community that was machshir a certain lungs, a reyas rucha, b'makom chitucha onot. And the custom of that city was to be machshir without checking the lungs at all. Now, what happened was that there were those who came from Ashkenaz that were machmir. And because there was Ashkenazim that came and they were machmir, so he had a question that people, even after the Ashkenazim left, there were people who remained and they wanted to keep that minhag. So once again, he had a case where the minhag was to be matir in a certain question of trefot. There was a community that came, was not clear how they came, but there were people that came that were machmir, and then there was those who wanted to keep that minhag. And on that, the Avkat Rochel, it seems to be that it was a heated debate. He says they become batel, they become nullified to the first place. And he writes the following, and he says that even though one place was rabim, they became rabim, they became many. Nevertheless, en lechalek ben yachid lerabim. One shouldn't make a distinction between the yachid and the rabim, and since they're called likutayim, everyone is considered they came from different places. They're all batil legabe. They're all going to be batil, and therefore says Avkat Rochel, the ones who are noeg lebi machmir, Kama batil. They are batil in regards to the first community. They are batil in regards to the first community. This Avkat Rochel is quoted heavily by different poskim to say that a community that comes into an established community is batil. And in truth, that's what it would be if I've said this before, but if I would move to New Zealand where there is no Sephardic community, me and two of my friends, it doesn't matter what I kept beforehand, I would basically be batil to the existing community, which means that I'd have to change my tefillin and whatever else. And that's a mefurish Mishnah in Masechet Psachim, daf in Perek Revi, haolech mimakom limakom ve'en dator lachzor, מקבל אליו מנהגים שיצא לשם. בין להקל, בין להחמיר. That's halacha psuka. Now, the problem is that if you're going to adopt this tshuva of the Avkat Rochel at face value, then basically, all of Klal Yisrael seems to be in a big mess. Because, let's take example America. So if there was an established community of the Spanish Portuguese Jews that first came to America in the 1600s, so anybody that came afterwards is going to be batel. So that means only Spanish and Portuguese Minhagim is what should go on in America. Or if you have a city like Chicago, that the first Jews that came to Chicago, presumably, I'm not an expert in history, but let's presume that they are Ashkenazi Jewry. That means you can't have a Sephardic community at all, which is difficult to understand. How could that be? But, and that's, I'm just taking examples in America, but you're going to travel throughout the world. You're going to have that dynamics of communities moving in, and eventually at some point, they're going to form another community. And the question is, when they form another community, do they have the status of a community or not? So you have the Avkat Rochel in Siman Lamed Bet. This is another Teshuvah that discusses communities that were noeg like the Rambam and communities that were noeg like the Rosh. We discussed in previous times how the Rosh was very influential in the Sephardic communities. We Rabban Shel Kol HaSfaradim. Maybe we'll have another opportunity to discuss it. But the Rosh, the Avkat Rochel in Siman Lamed Bet says that although there was a large community that followed the Rambam, and then came along the community that followed the Rosh, nevertheless, each kehila is noeg keminhaga, and no one takes away from the other. So there are those who ask right away, there's a stira between the Avkat Rochel. In one place, he says one community is batal to each other, and another one, the Avkat Rochel says they're not batal to each other. And it's obvious that there is a distinction over here, and the distinction, lechora, would be whether it's an organized community or it's not an organized community. Whether one is it's kehilot or they're not kehilot. Now the problem is in Avkat Rochel, he doesn't say that. Avkat Rochel in Siman Resh Yud Bet, he doesn't mention that it's a kehila or not a kehila. He's satum. But you have a problem, because in one place he says that kehilas follow their own minhagim, and in another place he writes that as people come along, they're batil, kama batil. So before I answer the Avkat Rochel, I want to go to another teshuvah in the Be'oto Zman, at the same time that around the same tkufa, the Mari Ben Lev had a similar tshuva, because there was these dynamics in many different communities. There was questions that came up. Mari Ben Lev was in Chelik Gimel Siman Yud Dalet. Also, he discusses regarding Koshten Dina that they would also be they would be makel on Nikur. They would be makel on Nikur, and in Aragon they would be more machmir. And he quotes over there that the difference is whether it's Yachid or Rabim. If you have a large amount of people, they're able to keep their minhagim. If you have a minority, they're not. There he's not mechalik between a kehila or not a kehila. All he mentions if it's Yachid and Rabim, and it's probably what the Bet Yosef was coming lafuke. The Bet Yosef, the Avkat Rochel was saying, Ein lechalik ben Yachid leRabim, the way the Mari Ben Lev was mechalik. No. So you see that the Bet Yosef didn't go with this chilik of the Mari Ben Lev. Rather, he went whether it's a kehi. It doesn't matter to him whether it was Rabim or it wasn't Rabim. So how are we going to be miyashiv this stira? How are we going to be miyashiv this stira? So there is Shelotu Tshuvot Yismach Lev from Rav Gagin. He was an old Yerushalayim Rav who the name Gagin afterwards, there was also the Keter Shem Tov, Rav Gagin. And he writes in Even Ezer, Dav Zayin, he discusses this Avkat Rochel. And he says that obviously in Siman Resh Yud Bet, we're talking about that there was no Kehila Bifnei Atzma. There was no organized community on its own. And when if there's an important distinction over here, that the Yismach Lev doesn't say that there wasn't a kehila on its own and then they formed a community. Rav Ovadia Yosef, though, in Yabia Omer, Chelek Zayin, this gets into the crux of the issue. Yabia Omer Chelek Hey, Yoredei Siman Gimel. He brings this stira between the Avkat Rochel and in Siman Resh Yud Bet and Siman Lamed Bet. And he says, Tzarich Lomar, Shanoagim Kedat HaRambam, which is in the Kehilot, Hayu Gam Kein Merubim, Ela Shenitma'atu Achar Kach, Mipnei Shebau Lisham, and then he writes in quotation, in parentheses, Bebat Achat Kehilot HaNoagim Kedat HaRosh. So says Rav Ovadia, what happened was, you have to say in Avkat Rochel, where he says there was a community of the Rambam and the Rosh, the Rambam's community was the main community, it shrunk, and then the Rosh community came in. But Rav Ovadia adds in a word that that Yismach Lev and others don't say. He says like this, that these communities came in, of the Rosh came in, Bebat Achat. And I think this is a hint to Rav Ovadia Yosef's opinion that the Kehilot that came to Eretz Yisrael, if they didn't come Bebat Achat, they came little by little, they're mitbatel. And once they become batel, eno chozer v'neor, they don't reawaken. They don't reawaken because the Bet Yosef says in Avkat Rochel Siman Resh Yud Bet that even if they became more afterwards, kama batil. So since you say kama batil, so therefore the Taimani community or a Moroccan community that's going to come to Eretz Yisrael, they're going to be batil. That seems to be his approach and understanding how we're going to resolve Siman Resh Yud Bet and Siman Lamed Bet. In Resh Yud Bet, we're talking about that they're coming. There was an established community, and other people came, and they didn't come as a community. Therefore, they're batel. Siman Lamed Bet, they came as a community, and therefore they're not batel. But if they wouldn't have came at the beginning as a community, then they would have. Then even if they make themselves a community afterwards, it seems to be from the words of Rav Ovadia Yosef that they're not that they can't form a community later. It seems to be from these words. Now, if we are going to understand that way, and we're going to understand that this is the opposition, why Rav Ovadia Yosef, and it's not only Rav Ovadia Yosef, Rav Ben Tzina Bashol in two places writes that he doesn't write it because of the Avkat Rochel exactly. He writes it more because of the Isra of Lotit Godidu, that he splits the communities in Israel. They have to integrate into three: either Ashkenazim, either Sfaradim, or either Teimanim. And that's how he writes. And these words are I'm going to explain, seems to be very, very difficult to understand in light of the poskim. So let's start with this Avkat Rochel. If we're going to say that communities have to come bebat achat in one shot, and that's the only way that they're going to become batel, where are you ever going to have communities in America of Sfaradim? The whole Sephardic Jewry in America is wiped off the map. If you follow this train of thought that in Eretz Yisrael communities should be batel to, and we'll discuss to what to be batel is something else, but they should be batel to a certain entity because they didn't come right away organized, even if they organize themselves afterwards. If you're going to say that, then literally in America you can't have Sfaradim, and probably the rest of the world as well, besides a few places. Or in some places you can have Ashkenazim, you can only have Sfaradim. It becomes a very sticky situation, and it becomes a situation that becomes very difficult to understand what the logic would be. In truth, the sources that Rav Ovadia Yosef brings don't indicate this. He brings one source, which is the Yismach Lev, as we mentioned. There, all he mentions, and I'll read you his Lashon of the Yismach Lev. He writes, "De besiman lamed bet," I'm quoting his exact language. "De besiman lamed bet, ayri bebet kehilot kedumot, asher ha'achat ke'arambam ve'bet ke'arosh, u'meyamim yamim nagu ken." He doesn't write that when they first came, they came bebat achad. He just writes that they were established communities. The second source is that he quotes from Rav Mendel HaKohen from Rabbanei Ashkenaz, that was in Cairo, not that long ago. And this Rav Mendel HaKohen writes that he came to Cairo and he found that there was no Ashkenazi community, so they formed an Ashkenazi community. And he says like this: Hen emet asher it's a sefer called Yad Re'em. Hen emet asher le'inyan halacha lema'aseh en shum nafukta po be'irenu kahir acharei shekvar na'asu keilot Ashkenazim kela b'fnei atzma. So the actual source that Rav Avad Yosef brings says lechora that even once they came, they weren't organized, but they made a community. So you do see from these sources that even once they came, they could still form a community afterwards. This is the psak that, if you take a look in Magen Avot, we bring from Rav Elyashiv, from the Ashkenazi Rabbanim. I'm quoting first, and I'll get to the Sephardi Rabbanim. From Rav Elyashiv and from Rav Vosner and from Rav Chaim Kanievsky, and all of the Rav Shach, others, that all back the ideas that kehilot that come to Eretz Yisrael, like the Yekis, there are other communities like Hasidic communities, they keep their minhagim as long as they build their kehillah. And their kehillah, we're going to discuss what that means. Rabbi Yashiv told me that means a minyan, and that's what he told other people as well. And this is what's defined as a community nowadays, is that people make a minyan and they're noegan. And lechora, it doesn't make a difference if the Yekis didn't come organized from the beginning and they came afterwards. Right now, they make themselves a community. Whenever they decide to make themselves a community, that will have the halachic, not only validity, not only the strength, but it will have the halachic ramifications and all that accompanies it of a community. Now, if you want to take a look more at this subject, there's a 6-volume sefer called Shorshei Minhagei Ashkenaz from Rabbi Binyamin Hamburger that discusses this. There's communities, then Kiryat Sefer and Bnei Brak, that they set up Yeki communities. And regarding the Moroccan communities, it's well known, Rabbi Shalom Misas's opinion, that the Moroccan communities are considered a kehila b'fnei atzma. Rabbi Baruch Toledano, Rabbi Basali, all of the Moroccan Rabbanim that came, that I mentioned, they came and they felt that the communities they keep their minhagim. They keep their minhagim. They're not mitbatel to whatever entity we'll discuss to be mitbatel to. So, besides the fact that Rabbi Ben Sina Bashal's words, I don't really know where they come from, because he says they should be mitbatel to 3 communities. The Sfaradim community, we discussed many times that Edut Mizrach and Sfaradim are rachok mi Mizrach mi Ma'arav, literally, no pun intended. That it's actually there's much of a difference between Kehilot HaMizrach and Kehilot HaMa'arav. But before we get to that, let's discuss, first of all, the Bet Yosef himself writes in Shelot Utshuvot Bet Yosef Siman Bet and Siman Gimel, that I already mentioned before, so I won't dwell on it, that when he moved to Eretz Yisrael, he wrote himself that there was communities, and he said, I'm in a Sephardic community here. I'm going to make, I know that there's Minhag Eretz Yisrael of the Minhag HaMistor Avim, but I have not deviated from any minhag that I kept beforehand. In other words, he says himself that he never deviated from any Sephardic minhag, and he kept it going. He doesn't even say that there was a community of Sfaradim. It seemed to be that there was many Sfaradim. That was already enough for him of a reason. But maybe there was a community. It's up for discussion. But the Bet Yosef himself says that there was communities throughout the years in Eretz Yisrael that kept their minhagim. Not only that, you see that from the Bet Yosef that there was communities that way. I was in Eretz Yisrael recently, so I prayed one day in a Moroccan minyan, and in back of me there was a big Talmid Chacham. His name is actually Rav Ovadia Yosef. He's the grandson of Rav Ovadia Rav Ovadia Yosef. He was the son of Rav Yaakov Yosef, who was Niftar, the eldest son of Rav Ovadia Yosef. And he told me that his father, Rav Yaakov Yosef, used to say also that you see from the Shulchan Aruch, and maybe it means from the Shilot Teshuvot Bet Yosef, that Maran wanted different communities in Eretz Yisrael, and Maran knew that like there was different communities in Eretz Yisrael that would always be noheg a certain way. So you always had different communities. So the question is, if you are going to take on that there is one central community, what is that community exactly? So let's examine what the options are. The first option that we're going to say is that, let's say there is a community in Eretz Yisrael called the Edut HaMizrach that follow Minhagim Yerushalayim. Now, Minhagim Yerushalayim is Yerushalayim, but it's not the rest of Yerushalayim. It's not the rest of Yerushalayim. So there's one tshuva of Rav Ovadia Yosef in Yebi Omer Chelek Daled Yoredei Asimen Lamed Aleph, where he mentions that there was a certain minhag against the Shulchan Aruch that Yerushalayim did about not doing kriya on Chol HaMoed, and then he writes that's only for Yerushalayim, but not everywhere else. That's against Maran. So so Minhag Yerushalayim would seem to be only for Minhag Yerushalayim itself, not for everywhere else. Nevertheless, to figure out what Minhag Yerushalayim is also unclear. Let me give you an example. The minhag of saying Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo on all brachot, whether Yatsa Yedei Chova or Lo Yatsa Yedei Chova. The Sefer Netivei Am of Rav Amram Aburmai, who wrote a Sefer on Minhag Yerushalayim, and he was actually originally from the north of Morocco, and he was a rabbi in Petach Tikva, and he wrote a wonderful Sefer called Netivei Am on Minhag Yerushalayim. And he writes over there that the minhag of Yerushalayim is to answer Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo on all brachot, whether Yatsa Yedei Chova or Lo Yatsa Yedei Chova. So there are minhagei Yerushalayim that way. As a matter of fact, as I saw that Netivei Am, afterwards they showed me one of the shiurim of one of the children of Rav Ovadia Yosef that said that when they first came to Eretz Yisrael, they saw that in one of the Batei Knesset, Bet Knesset Borachov, they would answer Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo all the time, and they said, well, it's a hefsek, how can you do that? But you see, everyone used to answer Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo, so it's not because they didn't know. That was the original Minhag Yerushalayim. That was the Minhag Yerushalayim, and there's other Minhagim as well that were for a long time in place. Minhag Yerushalayim, for example, not wearing tefillin on Tisha B'Av. The Minhag of Bet El changed it that people should wear tefillin on Tisha B'Av in the morning. But the original Minhag Yerushalayim was like the Shulchan Aruch, not to wear tefillin. Also, the Minhag of Eretz Yisrael was that if there's many Kohanim, the Kohanim start saying Yivarechecha. The Kohanim start saying Yivarechecha, but you see from over here that although that there was this is actually a very interesting thing. If you take a look in Halichot Olam Chelek Aleph Siman Kuf Tzaditet, there the Rav Ovadia Yosef brings the Minhag Eretz Yisrael and the Minhag Shulchan Aruch is that there's many Kohanim, they start Yivarechecha, but he says the Ben Ish Chai said to change it al pisod and Nachon la'asot ken im efshar. He says the ones who do like the Shulchan Aruch yesh lehem al malismok, but you should change it. Now you have Maran says all the Kohanim should do it at the same time. The Minhag Yerushalayim is also that way, but nevertheless, he felt it was important to change this minhag based on a reasoning that al pisod that every single word should be carried out, which is a pele. You would think it goes exactly against his shita, but sometimes great poskim they feel they want to change minhagim there. They do, but I'm just bringing out a point that Minhag Yerushalayim is something that is very unclear. And besides the fact it's something that's up for discussion, besides the fact it's not one community doing it. so what community are you going to be batel to? Elamai, you're going to say, okay, but you have to be batel to Maran. So that, once again, as you know from us, is one of our flagship subjects. Batel te dat Maran means exactly what Bnei Adat Ma'aravim. So if you want to say the Teimanim te batel te dat Maran, I'm not proficient in the derech hapsak of the Teimanim, how much they kept Maran, how much they didn't. But as we've spoken about in previous shurim, the Kabbalat Piskei Maran, first and foremost, came from Bnei Ma'arav. They were the ones who promoted this shita throughout the generations. So to come to say they should be batel to Maran, well, there's not to be batel to. That's exactly the shita that they were following throughout the generations. So this is why this subject is number one. Let's go for point by point. Number one, there is no source to say that a kehila that didn't come organized from the beginning should be it cannot form a kehila afterwards. There's no source to say that. Number two, I didn't speak this out. Who says that? Now specifically speaking about a Moroccan community. Who says that they didn't come organized from the beginning? We're talking about tens of thousands and eventually became hundreds of thousands of Jews who came. Of course, people came and they set up their communities right away. They weren't supposed to jump off a boat in one shot, right? We spoke about this before. They weren't supposed to jump about a boat in one shot. So that's number one. Number one is that, of course, who says that they can't form a community afterwards? Just like in halacha, you have a concept of choser v'ner over here too. Number two, who says it wasn't organized? As soon as they came, they set up communities. Number three, if you're going to say to be mitbatel to what? If it's mitbatel to Yerushalayim, very difficult to say what that is. If it's to be mitbatel to Atra de Maran, that's also not clear because that's exactly what the Minhagim were. So unfortunately, these things weren't explained fully in the writings of Rav Ben Zion, Rav Ovadia. They weren't fully midbarer, and it's things that have such tremendous ramifications. And as it wasn't midbarer so much, and we mentioned that the Gdolei Poskim, Hen Mitzah, the Moroccan Poskim, I know the Teimani Poskim are that way, as well as the Ashkenazi Poskim, all felt that the communities do keep their minhagim. Not only that, if you're going to say not that way, if you're going to say that they're actually going to be batel, you wipe away all the Sephardic communities in America and in most of the world. And since you see that that's not that way, it would seem to be barur that communities follow and have to follow their minhagim wherever it's shaykh. Now, a minhag is also something that has many different perushim to it. It has many different perushim. There's a phenomenal sefer that just came out from my dear friend. His name is Rav Yosef Peretz from Panama, and he put out a sefer called Torat Marrakesh. And there, what he did was that he gathered teshuvot from Chachmei Marrakesh that were never published before. I'm talking about dozens and dozens of Chachamim that people never saw their Torah before, and it was all put together in one sefer called Torat Marrakesh. And at the end, he has he has a section of his own teshuvot, Rav Yosef Peretz, and there he has a very clear ma'amar on minhagim. If you get the sefer, if you remind me, I'll try to send you the article on on the perush of minhag, because minhag is a very loose term. There's minhagim of minhagei iser. There's minhagim that is not minhagei iser, minhagei heter. There's minhagim that are just shinui nuschaot. There are minhagim that you're just doing it because there's no nafka mina le'alacha, but it's a form of keeping tradition and masora, and each one of them has its own ramifications. So what we're speaking about today is minhagim, and particularly minhagim that have to do that have ramifications le'halacha. For example, not eating kitniyot, or for example, to make a bracha on halal. For example, making a bracha, answering baruch Hu B'Shemo, things that we determined are solid minhagim. These are more famous minhagim that everyone talks about, but there's a lot of other small ones. There's one last point that I forgot to mention, is that in one of the discussions that Rav Ovadia Yosef has with Rabbi Shalom Misas in regards to Nat Barnat, whether Nat Barnat is do you follow Nat Barnat even lechatchila when you know you're going to be gorem and Nat Barnat? There's a teshuvah in Bedek Habayit that says you do, and Rav Shalom says we don't follow the Bedek Habayit. So Rav Yosef says yes, but once you came to Eretz Yisrael, you were Mekabel Maran Kemara De'atra, also in what's written in the Bedek Habayit. So on this, I think the explanation would be is that Rav Avodia is telling him is that if you accept Maran like Mitzad Gavra, you're accepting Mitzad the Mara De'atra. That means you're fully accepting the Shita. In other words, you're accepting Mitzad Gavra. But it's very difficult to say that Musig of Mara De'atra of Gavra when the Mara De'atra was only accepted after he was Nifter, which Maran, his psakim were only accepted after he was Niftar. So it's not that you're not accepting the Gavra Mitzad, the Gavra, accepting his psakim. Accepting his psakim, our tradition was only to accept in Bet Yosef and in Shulchan Aruch. So once again, these are very lengthy discussions. I know we spoke about it before, but I felt that a few nikudot that over here were mitbarer that we didn't speak about last time. Mainly, number one, there doesn't seem to be any chiluk whether a kehila it comes bibat achat or it doesn't come bibat achat. And number two, that it shouldn't make a difference as well. In our case, because even if the communities lechora came in one shot, and even if they didn't go, and even without that, what exactly are people being mitbatel to is also not clear. I mean, throughout the generations, it was Keilot HaMa'aravim in Eretz Yisrael. Always there's Keilot Pekudat Elazar. Even before, and there was always Keilot HaMa'aravim. So that's more or less the discussions, and maybe next time we'll go into other inyanim, but I just felt it was important to clarify this one. Chazak u'baruch.